Good evening, my dear colleagues. Welcome to another INGET Zoom series. Today we have two guests, Leo Gomez and Michael Landry from Learn Your English. Leo Gomez, who holds an MA in TESOL, is a teacher educator, manager, and materials writer who has been working with ELT for over 20 years in 5 different countries. Michael Landry, who is a PhD candidate, has worked extensively in Asia and Canada as an academic manager, teacher educator, and university lecturer. This evening, the title of their talk is Task-Based Language Teaching, From Tasks and Beyond. Thank you, dear Leo and Michael, for being our guest speakers tonight, and welcome again. The screen is all yours.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Wow,
Thanks for
right,
joining us.
Let's get started.
I'm
Hello, everyone.
Screen.
Yeah. Marhaba. Yeah, nice to see you all. And Tasukula. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us and having us here. We're really excited. Just one thing to add to Leo's bio. He's also just a really great guy. So it's and it's a pleasure to be presenting with him. Just like it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So we're going to just start off by introducing our company. But first, if you're not following us on Instagram, please do, because we are fairly active on Instagram. And we find it's just a great way to stay in touch after the show. So it's at Learn Your English, and it would be really great to just keep in touch. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So let's have a look at what's on tap, Leo? So today, we'll give you a small brief introduction just into what is Learn Your English. But our main focus is task-based language teaching. And it's a very practical approach of how to include task-based language teaching in your classrooms. And then I think the whole goal would be for all of us to have a nice little chat at the end where we can kind of focus on some final thoughts. And maybe you can share your own context with us and think about how what we talk about might relate to your teaching situation. So let's start off with an introduction of who we are. So we actually started off as a podcast, and some of you out there might know us because of our Teaching Talking Time podcast. It's a chance for us to interview some of the leading experts, if you will, or researchers in the field, and really relate what they're doing, all that great work, to the everyday teacher in their classroom. And actually, we've partnered with Carleton University here in Ottawa, Canada. And we work with their master's program to facilitate interviews. So their candidates interview leading experts. In this case, they're interviewing experts in corrective feedback. And then we host that on our website. So what we're really trying to do is to help create a bridge for the researchers and the teachers to help us see where we should be applying some of this research and where we shouldn't be chasing it or going down rabbit holes, losing ourselves in it. So we started off doing that. We really enjoyed it. And we also started off as a grassroots organization. And what I mean by that is in Toronto, where Leo is, I'm on the West Coast in British Columbia, we created a face-to-face community of like-minded teachers who really wanted to decide for themselves what aspects of teaching they wanted to become better at. And that kind of grew into this online community. So about a year and a half ago, we started our online grassroots organization, which is kind of like in a complement, if you will, to like IA, TEFL, and INGET, and these other great organizations. And what we do is we actually we encourage teachers to kind of direct their own developmental goals, and we work with them on this. And I can explain how we do that just briefly. So we do that through our support. So we have we're creating a teacher development program from September and October. And I know some of our members are actually here in the audience, but we're trying to combine some asynchronous studies with some workshopping that we do on a monthly basis. And how that breaks down is, Leo, how that breaks down is we meet at the beginning of the month and we'll introduce a teaching challenge. And then we'll provide or come up with some readings that can help direct that conversation. And each one of us will start thinking about some targets that we might do to help work on that aspect of teaching. So it could be task-based language teaching. It could be how to explain or teach grammar. So we come together, we set that target, and we come up with a little challenge. And then in the middle of the month, we have these check-in points, Leo, which is basically our lunch and learn, where we do two things. We return to that theme, or we actually just talk a little bit about what's happening in our classrooms, maybe trouble or problematize something we've been doing. And we really just try to help each other. We try to coach one another and guide our own development. And then finally, at the end of the month, we'll come back and we'll have a roundtable discussion together. And we'll talk about, what was the challenge? What were some of the struggles? What were some of the achievements we had in our own classroom? And how could we maybe change or alter our practice going forward? And I emphasize the bottom up because we're not prescribing what teachers should be doing. We're saying, here's an aspect of teaching. Let's work on it together and share our successes and get over our failures together. So it's a really great feeling. It's a great community. We have a lot of fun. And then also, in addition to that, members in this program also can access, or we have access to, our self-directed learning portal. So this is a service we have for students, but we find a lot of teachers use it because it has a lot of materials. The focus is very much on self-directed study. So we're going to talk about that a little bit in our task-based language teaching program presentation today, but these are the types of things that we often don't have time for in the classroom, like how to build habits that help our students study outside of the classroom. So this is a portal we created for students, and we partnered with classes and organizations, but we find a lot of teachers like to use it as well because they can find students, but also they have materials at hand. And just one more point onto that, next slide, Leo, is that we do encourage our members to take part in any of the work we do. We encourage them to lead sessions in our monthly challenges. We encourage them to lead lunch and learns. We encourage them to teach in our self-directed learning portal whenever possible. And these are the ways that we try to give back, so that when teachers are signing up to join our community, they're actually, hopefully in some cases, making this money back somehow, either through helping us with some projects like publishing, but also through some of our workshops and so on. So that's essentially what we are and who we are. And we really hope that you check us out. But in this session, really our focus is on task-based language teaching. Leo and I are so passionate about it. And I think the reason we like it is because, as Dr. Erzo says, the students should be the stars in the classroom. And we find that if that's the case, then task-based language teaching is probably the best way to do it. And that's what we're going to focus on today. But we will talk on what we mean by the word task. What are some examples of tasks? How do we incorporate the task? And we're going to focus on the task cycle in particular. I think Leo's going to talk a little bit about reflecting on roles. So while this is all happening, what are we doing as teachers to help our students shine as stars? And then finally, our own philosophy about why we feel that this is such a powerful tool teachers can use. So let's get started. And I think by the end of this, at the end of this lesson, you will be able to identify a task. You probably will come away with a real good idea of how you can approach a task-based language teaching lesson. And again, think critically about what you're doing and what the students are doing and how to maximize their role as stars in the classroom. So let's get started. So the first task is actually a little warm-up task. And I'd like for us to think a little bit about defining a task. So I think next slide, Leo. How would you define a task? Why don't you share with us in the chat how you would define a task? And let's see if we can get some consistent words or themes coming here. Let me open the chat. Yeah, thank you, Leo. Nice prompt. Ooh.
So we have Azran saying it's meaning, goal, and outcome. Egeman said authentic. Sharif said searching. Interesting. Funda said effort. Mina said there is an outcome. Sertel says the means of which attaining a goal or objective. Nilay said it's an activity to reach a specific goal and gain experience while completing it. Aidan said verbal or non-verbal acts that require meaning communication. It should include some challenge. I like what Mehmet said here. Karsiaka, I might be butchering your name, so I apologize. There should be a goal. Aim says, Ozge. Ali says a mission to accomplish. I like that. Purposeful. Okay. Yeah. So we have some good definitions.
Yeah, yeah. And I think actually, sounds like you already know a lot. So maybe that's the end of the workshop, Erzos. Dr. Erzos, we'll just stop it there. No, we're not going to do that. You're dedicating your Friday nights to us. We're going to respect that. Okay, so let's look at a definition. Let's see what the experts say, so to speak. Well, I'll give you 15 and a half seconds to read this. And let's see if any of our words in the chat are here in this definition. Let's see. Yeah, and I think Leo's going through here. Like you had engage, communicative purpose. Someone said achievement, purpose definitely came up. Processes. And I would say natural and authentic, Leo. I think that ties into the comment someone said about meaning and meaningful, that it's meaning focused and it needs to be really something that the students connect with. That's great. So let's have a look here at some of the other kind of key features that might come up here. Clear as mud, right? Okay, so let's start off. Some of you already said this. It's a process with a clear goal. And it's not necessarily a linguistic goal. In many cases, it's not. It's not, right? It's not task-guided or supported language teaching. It's task-based language teaching. So the purpose of completing the task is the actual goal. Next.
Mike, one thing that is important for you to say, just to chime in here, folks, is I think a lot of the problems that people have with getting a very good grasp, a very good understanding of task-based language teaching is that, Leo, if I teach the present perfect and use a task, is that task-based language teaching? It's not. It's task-supported. Okay, because you're telling your students which language to use. With task-based language teaching, the focus is not to prescribe, is not to tell your students which language to use, is to give them an opportunity to communicate in the language to achieve a goal. But that's something important to bear in mind here.
I think it's great. And it's going to definitely connect to what you say later about the roles, right? Also, it's a series of steps. So I think that came up in one of the comments as well, right? So it's a purpose, but it's scaffolded, right? There are steps that you're going to take to get to that goal. And we've underlined cognitive and communicative processes. Yeah, like think about this. To complete a task, and we're going to look at a sample on a few slides from now. But when we complete tasks and when we're scaffolding the steps, our brain is doing different things at different stages. And it's up to us as teachers to think about those processes and to kind of think about what are the teaching points that might come around those.
Mm-hmm. Or in other words, Mike, what do you have to do what you're doing?
Exactly.
Okay. So just think about what do you have to do what you have to do.
And then someone said outcome. Yeah, exactly. There's a clear outcome. So maybe it's to, and then successful, there's a clear outcome, and then success is actually measured on whether or not they are able to achieve that outcome. So this is often referred to as task completion. Yeah. So let's have a look at an example. So a working example might be an everyday task for a person living in Canada might be making a restaurant reservation. Well, maybe not now. This is actually a little dated, but this is part of a larger 3-hour workshop that Leo and I have slimmed down to a 45 to 60 minute workshop. But if we take the idea of making a restaurant reservation, there's steps involved in that, aren't there? You need to visit the website. You might want to compare different options, make decisions, make a call online or book online. And of course, receive that confirmation, successful completion. The process is involved, as you can already imagine, right? You're going to read the reviews, you're going to compare options, you're going to rationalize your decision, and then of course you're going to make that final choice. And then finally, the outcome is that successful completion, and proof of that completion is the confirmation. Yeah, so we can see how no language is mentioned here at all, but as Leo suggested, in each one of these, the language is going to emerge, right? And that's where we're going to be able to identify opportunities to teach to the need, so to speak. But we'll talk about that when we look at the task cycle.
There was a very interesting comment here, Mike, by, I think it was by, who was that? I lost it here. Aidan, that says, the process is more important than the product. So I think the process here in this case, as you said, Mike, the process is the students engaging in all these acts of communication using whatever language they have available to achieve that specific outcome, as opposed to us saying, hey, use the present simple to do this. And we all know that Mike knows this, I call PPP, which is the presentation, practice, production, I call that the language straitjacket, because it really limits what you can do with the language. And we all know that you cannot communicate in a language only using one verb tense, yet this is often the expectation that we place on our students. Anyway, moving on, Mike.
So yeah, so let's look at some common criteria used for judging whether or not a task is a task. This goes back to what Leo said. How do I know it's a task-based, like a task itself, or how do I know it's just an activity to get them to use language? So that's really what we're looking at here. What makes a task a task? So let's have a look. So this is from Jane and David Willis. It's a great little kind of checklist, if you will, of what makes a task a task. So some of you have already mentioned these. So the first one is engaging the learner's interest. All of you know a great lesson starts with you being aware of what your own students need and want to learn. Okay, so that's key. Second, yeah, there's this kind of focus on meaning, as someone said earlier. And as Leo just said, the learners are free to use whatever they have at their disposal, right? That's how they're going to build on their spontaneous language learning, right? Their ability to communicate in the moment, in situ. So we want that. That's a good thing, right? And then obviously there's this clear goal, not language or linguistically based, but rather a real goal or outcome that they're striving towards. And then in terms of success, it's actually completing the task, not their ability to use the present perfect or past tense or gerunds in the infinitive and so on. And then finally, and this goes back to number one, it's almost like a full circle, is it real world? Okay, so does the activity relate to the world? In this case, the world of the student. So if you're teaching high school students, is it a real world task a high school student would do? If you're dealing with new Canadians or people who are new to your country, it's what would they need in their situation, and what's a task that relates to that? Leo, I don't know if you want to add some more.
I was just going to say what's really important, and I think there is a lot of confusion about task-based language teaching and this idea of being authentic. I would argue, and again, feel free to disagree with me. I love when people disagree with me because that means we engage in a more critical conversation, and that's the kind of thing that I'm here for. But I would say that nothing that we do in the classroom is authentic. So the classroom in itself is already a very artificial environment. So the only thing we can do is to create conditions where they can actually use language in a more authentic way to, as Mike said, to complete a real world task. And again, it doesn't mean that the task has to be authentic, but the language that the students are using has to come naturally from their desire to achieve a very specific meaning. So in other words, students are learning how to mean. All right, I'm taking over now, right, Mike?
No, I think you are actually. Yeah, beautiful. So that's a perfect segue. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to be looking into the different types of tasks. So based on that terminology that the questions that we just looked at from Dave and Jane Willis, we're going to be looking at the different types of tasks that we can use in the classroom that we can provide our students with. And there's a wide variety of tasks. As you can see, we have tasks where students have to write lists. And I find that the listing is a very good example of a task that you can use with very real beginners. So a lot of people say, Leo, you can't use task-based language teaching with beginners. I beg to differ. I think you can. I think students do have some sort of English within them, and it's your job to find a way to get that language out of them. This is why we always welcome students in our class. When you welcome them, the quantity of your students learning will depend on the quality of the attention that they give to the lesson. And in order for them to give attention to the lesson, you have to give them something meaningful. So even if it's something simple as, can you write down all the words that you know in English? That's a very simple example of a listing. We also have ordering and sorting, where you can do some of that. You have comparing, where students have to compare two different things. That's a very simple one where you can actually ask students to compare two restaurants and decide which restaurant they want to go to. We have problem solving. I think someone mentioned here in the chat, so thank you for bringing that up. Yes, Azran said Prabhu also has a list of tasks. And if you're interested in the story behind Prabhu's task-based language teaching, I would strongly recommend that you listen to the interview that Mike and I did with Jane Willis, because Jane Willis talked about when she was in the classroom in India, talking and observing lessons from Prabhu. So I'm not going to spoil the fun. So if you want to listen to the podcast, maybe Mike can, I think it's episode 14 of our podcast.
I'll put it in the chat. Yeah.
Yes. Also something very meaningful in terms of tasks, sharing personal experiences. I think we all love talking about ourselves. Hence the fact that I is one of the most common pronouns, high frequency pronouns in English. And of course, we also have creative tasks, which I would say to a certain extent lends itself to a little bit of what we call project-based learning, or what some people call project or problem-based learning, because they have to come up with creative ideas. They have to produce something, and they engage with the language within the task. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you more here examples. I kind of already talked about these. What I'm going to do now is we're going to do a little bit of a checkpoint now, just to make sure that everyone is following us, just to make sure that you're not falling asleep and you're still with us. So we're going to try to activate everything that you have learned about tasks so far. So I'm going to copy and paste the types of tasks, and I'm going to give everyone a chance. So here are the list. Number 1, ordering, sorting. 2, creative. 3, sharing personal experience, problem solving, opinion, and listing. I want everyone to look at the first one here and decide whether you think number 1 is a creative task, and ordering and sorting, sharing a personal experience, problem solving, or opinion or listing. What do you think about number 1? So we have Isel saying it's listing. Daphne said ordering and sorting. Okay. I like to tell people this. You have to rank. When you rank, what do you have to do before you rank anything? You have to list, right? So if somebody said listing, so you have to first list, and then you have to order. So that's an interesting point, because it goes to show that you can actually create hybrid tasks. You don't have to create a task that is only creative. You don't have to create a task that is only to give an opinion. So you can add more complexity to these tasks by mixing them up a little bit. Thank you. Let's move on to number 2 now. Yes, I agree. There's a little bit of opinion as well. Yeah. As I said, you can't really say that a task only does one thing, because as Mike said earlier, there are many cognitive processes involved in task-based language learning. How about number 2? Students have to draw a plan of their house, and then they have to mingle and find a suitable tenant. So, the messages are going crazy here. Let me see if I can catch
creative, Leo, problem solving. I'll read them out. Creative,
okay.
Problem solving.
They have to draw. That's creative, to a certain extent. And then they have to mingle. So it involves, a little bit of communication. And then they have to find a suitable tenant. Well, they're going to have to share personal experiences. They have to do a little bit of problem solving. Yeah. So there is a little bit of everything. Yeah. How about number 3, folks? This is one that I've used with teenagers and it worked really well. They have to describe 2 of their favorite apps and apps which say something about their identity. Believe it or not, most of my students said TikTok.
Compare and share. Yeah. Compare, sharing personal experiences. Alex says, Mia says, comparing. Cooper says sharing a personal experience.
Good. That's good.
Okay.
Yeah. Moving on to number 4. Number 4 is one that I've been using quite successfully, I would say, with if any of you here teach English for academic purposes, I would strongly recommend that you actually try something like this, where you give students 2 different articles from the internet. And one is fake news and the other one is actually from a reliable source. And you can actually have them work with that and see if they can decide. In this case, what kind of task or what kind of task are we looking at? What cognitive processes are involved here?
Yeah, seeing comparing's coming up a lot. Critical thinking. I think critical thinking is involved in a lot of these.
Yep.
And again, this is one where you might want to kind of combine things, right? You might want to list the reason, list the criteria for why you feel one is A and one is B.
Oh,
and then compare.
I like what Aiden said here. Media literacy. Yes. Something that we were not taught in life. And I think this is why fake news is so pervasive in our societies these days, because we're not. And I would say that perhaps a good pre-task to the task would be to teach your students what are the characteristics or what is so common in fake news articles, right? So that could be a pre-task where you kind of prime them and prepare them for the task. And then eventually they can apply that knowledge. And there was a question that came at the beginning here, Mike, and it was a very good question. Somebody said that, so in task-based learning is a little bit of skill building and then skill using. I think that was the question. If you ask that question, you could perhaps ask that question again. Azra said consciousness raising tasks. You can do that. I think Ellis does a lot of consciousness raising tasks. We would argue that you can actually do CR tasks after the task, after you have completed the task. And well, you've already seen number 5 and number 6. We can actually move on here. This is the ideas that we had. Of course, this is not written in stone. You could perhaps add, as many of you have argued, that some of these involve more than one. Primarily, they would be classified as these. But again, as Mike and I, with our research on task-based language teaching and everything that we have been learning about this, we would argue that, again, you can't really say that a task only involves one of each. Which brings us to the classroom application of task-based language teaching. How does it actually work in the classroom? And Mike, I think you wanted to talk about this. This is me. It's me. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about something that Cook said back in 2010, and I actually liked here because I think the key word for all of us here is the word that it reconceptualizes communicative language teaching. And what do I when I think about reconceptualization, I'm thinking about what I said earlier. And this is something that I read by Stevick, and it really stuck with me for a very long time. The quantity of your students' attention, or of your students' learning, I guess I should say, will depend on the quality of the attention that they give to it. And the quality of their attention will depend, in turn, on the degree to which they are able and willing to throw themselves into what is going on. And what do I mean by that? In a lesson where the teacher spends a lot of time presenting the language, Today, we're going to talk about the present continuous. So you spend 20 minutes presenting the present continuous. And then eventually, in those 20 minutes, I don't know how many of you have kids. I have kids. My kids cannot focus for more than 3 minutes. In this younger generation, if you teach the present continuous and you spend 20 minutes presenting, it's what Mike and I like to say, talking about the language and then practicing through, drills, controlled practice activities. And only at the end, you have about 5 minutes to use the language. I think that's very ineffective use of the language. And what Cook is basically saying is that task-based language teaching somewhat flips this around, where we start with meaning first. Students start by learning how to mean, and then they fine-tune their language as they go through the process of communicating in the language. And also commenting on this, I think it was something that Dewey also said, we're not teaching language as a finished product. We're not teaching the present continuous as, this is what the present continuous is, and it's written in stone. It's not what we're looking at. Okay, we're looking at language from a completely social, purposeful, and functional way. And I think what Dewey was arguing here is that learning needs to be focused, learning needs to be shaped so that it meets the personally held interests that learners bring with them to the classroom. And I think that's the quantity of the learning that will happen in the classroom is very much dependent on their ability to be invested. Okay, most language teaching today is presenting material as a string of received facts that are completely unconnected to the learner's interests and completely unconnected to the learner's personal goals. Hence the fact that a lot of people don't like learning languages because they often associate language learning with learning the grammar. Okay, so let's move on here. So as I was saying, with the current status quo in language teaching, what we do is we teach the rule, we practice the rule, and then we use the rule. What we call the presentation, practice, and pray. You pray that students are going to use the language. But most of the time, students don't use the language when they get to the last P. You say, that was good, but you didn't use the present continuous. And we learned the present continuous. You have to use it. Like, how can we dictate what students are supposed to use when they're communicating? Nobody tells us what language to use when we're communicating. So this is going to be replaced by something that is more in line with second language acquisition research, where we learn by doing. It's not learn, then doing. We're learning by doing, where we have a pre-task, we have a task, and then we have a post-task. And students are often using the language throughout the entire process, which brings us to the most important, the key principles of task-based language teaching. Task-based language teaching works because students are invested, because they are at the forefront of learning right from the beginning. Also, task-based language teaching prioritizes meaning. Meaning comes first. It's not meaning at the expense of accuracy. It's meaning first, accuracy later, because first we learn to mean. Kids don't learn, like, I don't know if you have kids, but my kids never learn how to say, Daddy, go watch TV. They never said, Daddy, are you going to watch TV, by the way? They never grammarized it that way. They started with very simple words. So fluency first. A lot of the language, a lot of the grammar that you focus on, it will naturally emerge from the interactions that the students are having in the language. So as a teacher, you really need to be attuned to what students are saying. So you have to be a very active listener in that case. And of course, task-based language teaching is very much in line with Vygotskian theory, where language is a social and physical act rather than a passive act, which brings us to the task cycle, Mike. You're muted.
Of course I'm muted. Okay. Yeah. So no, this is really good. So just to kind of like a check-in. So we've talked a little bit about, what is a task. We've talked a little bit about different types of tasks. As Leo's pointed out, we've talked a little bit about the whole purpose and rationale behind this approach. So, Leo and I, we always say we practice what we preach in our membership meetings at Learn Your English. We always try to use real world lessons that we've created. And tonight we're going to share with you an example of a task cycle and how we've incorporated it. So we're drawing on Jane Willis's framework here, which is, this is a great little diagram, but that's what it is, folks. So we can see it kind of has this narrow approach with like different things in between. Obviously a pre-task, the task cycle itself, and then the language focus. And we're going to break each one of these down bit by bit, and we're going to do so with a real world activity that we've used in our own lessons. So let's get at it. So the real world lesson we've used is we have a lot of students that we teach here in Canada that are from outside of Canada. And a lot of them are students or new Canadians who are trying to find their feet. So again, going back to this idea of authentic and meaningful, we thought, a real useful lesson for our learners is this idea of a tenancy agreement situation, because many of them are trying to find a place to live, or they've been here for a year and it's now time for them to renegotiate their lease. So we thought, that's a real good real world task where some language that they would need would emerge naturally. So let's have a look at how we did this. So for a pre-task, the goal here of this pre-task is to really get them exploring. Someone said in the chat earlier, reflecting. Yeah, like what we're trying to do is kind of activate what they already know about the topic. We want them to take what they know and then maybe apply it to a newer context, in this case, the Canadian context. So what we're doing here, we're exploring with the class the topic itself. Now, we're pre-teaching words, but notice it says here, we're highlighting useful words and phrases. What we're not doing is giving a list of vocabulary, because as Leo said earlier, we don't want to prescribe and say, use these words. We want to find out what words and vocabulary, what resources do the students already have first, and then how can we maybe build from there, so to speak. But to give you an idea of some highlight useful words, well, tenancy agreement, landlord, these sorts of words would be keywords you need just to understand the concept of a tenancy agreement. And of course, we give them the instructions and then we talk about it. So the pre-task agreement would be basically they need to, what is a tenancy agreement? We might teach the words like landlord, tenant, deposit, sublet. Again, these are words that you would need just to talk about it, okay? Not a list of prescribed keywords that they need to use. You also might want to share an anecdote, right? You might want to talk about your own experiences. I'm sure lots of your own students will have experiences that they can tell you about. You might actually want to ask them what a tenancy agreement looks like in their own country. Yeah. I think I skipped a stage there, Leo, but that's all right. Now, Leo's going to talk a little bit about the roles here, but let me ask you, just in general, in the chat, what do you think your role as a teacher might be here? Are you kind of leading or are you kind of guiding from the side, do you think? In the pre-task? Facilitator, yeah, because certainly you're going to want to know what they know. You can't do that while you're speaking, right? Yeah, Nilay says guiding. I think there also is that guide because you're also presenting the context and the situation as well. Yeah, we'll move on because I know Leo wants to talk about this in more detail later, but I think you're on the right track. So then next stage, after we've introduced the task and they're familiar with basically what a tenancy agreement is and who's involved, the next part is the actual task itself. So you'll notice that Willis breaks this down into 3 subcategories. So there's the task itself, planning, and then reporting. So we're going to break those down as well. So the task, the students just do the task. Some people might know this as the deep end approach. Okay, so they might do this task in small groups, and the teacher is going to monitor and maybe take notes of mistakes or points of opportunities where you might be able to give them more language, but you're not going to interrupt them. You're just going to let them struggle, so to speak, but in a positive way. So let's have a look. So here, our task would be creating a tenancy agreement. Okay, so we would, yeah, so perhaps the students themselves would brainstorm the different kinds of things tenants might want to know. Okay, because remember, we need steps here, right? So the first stage is, what do you think a tenant might need to know or want to know about? Well, maybe the use of the premises, the rent, utilities, renewal. So they're drafting and crafting this list together in their groups as they go. And this is really cool. What we typically like to do is also, once they've done this, is we'll actually come in and provide them with a model. You can see there's one here in a PDF at the bottom of the slide where the students can then themselves look at what's in the model tenancy agreement and then go back to their list and maybe add some more. So for example, they might have left out things like repairs or appliances. So they would notice that in the model and then go back to their list and maybe refine it a little bit.
Mike, what's important for us to mention here very quickly is that this actually provides a very good opportunity for you later on in the lesson to do a genre analysis with your students. So if you want to analyze the specific features of the genre, which is a tenancy agreement, you can actually spend some time after that, and then your students can actually craft a new tenancy agreement.
Yeah, so then the next stage would be we then divide the class into landlords and tenants. So then again, we're kind of regrouping here, right? We're dividing them up. Here are the factors that you're going to consider, and now you're going to consider them from two perspectives, one the landlord perspective and one the tenant's perspective. Someone said earlier in the chat, and Leo, you touched on this, about language being social. I think an under-taught skill is this idea of perspective taking. And I think that this task is kind of serving this other cognitive function, which is, what would the other person want, as well as my own position? And I think that's a real kind of under-taught skill. And I feel that this task really touches on that. And then, of course, they're going to craft their tenancy agreement based on their specific perspective, right? So they're going to pool their ideas and create their list as a landlord and their agreement as a tenant in those respective groups. And again, thinking a little bit about the teaching roles, just as I'm speaking here, you might think, what do you think would be your role here? Hands-on, hands-off. I'll give you two options. Okay, yeah, seeing some hands-off. You can almost kind of sense it from the way it's drawn up in the plan. Fantastic. Let's see what's next then. So the next stage, and I think Jane Willis and certainly others would argue that the next stage in the planning is actually quite important. It's important to hold students accountable for what they've created. So what we do is we're going to prepare them for their presentation. So this is a stage where they're going to be refining their language. Leo talked about that earlier. So now that they have their ideas, we're now going to ask them to prepare a presentation. And it's at this stage they're going to start a little bit thinking about how they want to project themselves to the audience. So this is really, really important because what we're trying to do is to kind of push their output to make it so that they actually are more aware of their language and they're refining their accuracy and so on. So here, the teacher is kind of monitoring and maybe kind of giving advice or scaffolding it in some way. But again, the goal here is for them to be aware of what they've written and to refine that language to make it appropriate for their audience. So yeah, so we're going to pair them off in terms of one student, one tenant. And they're going to look at what the tenant came up with, what the landlord came up with, and then together they're going to negotiate what they feel would be a reasonable tenancy agreement. And hopefully, while they're doing that, one is helping the other refine the language. And the goal here is for them to reach a new kind of agreement that is both mutually acceptable to both a landlord and a tenant. So each group is going to be doing that. So again, what do you think is your role here when they're doing this kind of planning stage of taking what they have and refining it before they present it? Certainly monitoring. Yeah. Because you have to know if there's any points of need, right? Oh, you didn't say this. Maybe this is a way of, yeah, maybe facilitating, but perhaps even a little bit more actively, right? Yeah, like I wonder, are you trying to say this, or do you mean this? This type of active listening skill set where you might talk them into an answer, or perhaps give some models if necessary. This might be a good point for you to, again, go back to the model and say, is that how it's worded in the agreement I showed you earlier, right? And then you can, again, generate this kind of feeling of discovery. Well done. If needed. I think that's a good point, Nile. If needed. Yeah. We don't want to jump in. It's if needed. And finally, the reporting stage. And again, this is why it's so important to have this here, right? As Meryl Swain would say, you want to project the ideal you when you're out there, right? So in this case, they're refining their language, and now they're presenting it hopefully in a way where they're very much aware of what they're saying and doing, and their input, or their output rather, is going to be better because of that. So how do we do this? Oh, well, they can present their ideas. They could present it as a written one. They can exchange their written agreements with another team and compare what was similar and different, or they could actually present it orally. But basically, what we're doing here is hopefully getting them to produce all of that great work that they've come up with.
Mike, one thing I wanted to add, which is important for us to bear in mind, is that students are producing language at 3 different points here. Okay, they're producing language when they're doing the task. They're producing language when they're planning what they're going to say during the report stage, and of course, they're producing more language when they're reporting. What is very interesting is a lot of people say, "Oh, Leo, but task-based language teaching only focuses on meaning. Students are only using they're only using the same kind of language." I would argue that this is actually not true, and Mike just said that. During the task, what happens is students are going to be using whatever language they have at their disposal. So it's going to be language that is more informal in nature. Okay, they're going to be using whatever they can. Eventually, when they get to the planning and the report, because they're going to be talking to a very specific audience, they're going to be automatically shifting into a language that is somewhat or slightly more formal than the language that they use during the task. So they are giving themselves a bit of an upgrade into their language, because now they have to, they have to save face. They don't want to be embarrassed in front of everyone. So they are doing a little bit of preparation. And they're, of course, in this process, they are using language for 2 different purposes. So that's another beauty of task-based language teaching.
So yeah, so each one's going to produce their own contract. Again, as Leo said earlier, for an audience. So it's going to be more refined, probably more formal. And then they can exchange those contracts and give give feedback on one another's work. So again, here at the stage when we think of our role, perhaps you're already thinking a little bit about how you might just want to let them go, right? Let them go and see how their message is received. Okay, so let's finish it off then. So finally, as Leo said, this is where we can now look at the language. So once we have those final models that they've created, we can now go in and look at some specific features that might have been omitted, or some other areas where we could maybe enhance their message. Okay, so we could give feedback on, and it says here we can give feedback on their agreement. We can again go back into the model, use discourse analysis, and really highlight some key patterns. And then we can also, again, go back to what we've noticed when we were monitoring in the task and planning stage, and add some of those keywords that maybe they were thinking of but didn't have at their disposal. So we can add those at that point. Yeah. So what language do you think would naturally emerge in a lesson about writing a tenancy agreement?
So in other words, what grammar, right? What grammar do you think?
Yeah, what grammar? Would
you were to
present
teach.
perfect be here? Probably not, people. I'm going to say probably not present perfect. But what language might emerge from a tendency agreement? Modals, awesome. Passive voice. I like more specifically have to, must, should, imperatives. Yeah, comparative. See, I don't even know why we're here tonight, Leo. No, I'm joking. We're here because we're sharing, right? We're sharing.
Conditions are good, especially because, negotiation, right? We're going to have
or contract obligations. If you don't, well, then what's going to happen? All right, let's have a look here, people. Let's have a look at what we've come out, because I know we're kind of looking at the clock and saying, oh my gosh. Okay, so someone said modals already. Yeah, like modals of permission, modals of obligation. Let's go, Leo. Yep. Functional language related to different notions, asking permission or stating obligation, these sorts of things.
Like, would it be possible? Could you just, are we allowed to? Yeah.
Different kinds of conditionals, as someone has mentioned, right? So if rent is not paid by, unless, so not just if, but other adverbials that can be used in that same pattern. Adjectives to describe personality traits. This is where present perfect might come up. Have you ever committed a crime? Maybe it might be there. Formal language, exactly, of contracts. Leo touched on that earlier. Formality, register. Anything else here? No. So Leo's going to touch briefly on reflecting roles and what it all means going forward in terms of a sound philosophy of education.
Yeah, I think it's important when it comes to task-based language teaching. One thing that we wanted to talk about, Mike, is the task repetition, because Willis's model doesn't really, you end with the grammar part. You end with talking about the language that emerged. What we actually find that is really important, I think the only person that I've seen talking about task repetition recently was Scott Thornbury, talking about the idea of task repetition. If you're interested in task repetition, Bygate is your go-to person who talks a lot about this idea of once you finish the task, you should go back and give your students another opportunity to do the same task, but this time they can use the language that you focused on during the language analysis. And Mike likes to say this, that teachers don't like repeating tasks, right, Mike?
The only people that don't like repeating tasks are teachers. Students really want it. They want it. They're like, can we do it again? Can I try it again? And oftentimes when they do that, they have a lot more confidence and they produce much better output, which is great.
And how often in life do we get something right the first time?
Never.
Only in the English language classroom with the present perfect that we expect.
My partner would argue that I never get anything right, but that's a conversation for.
So also in terms of task repetition, if you don't want to use exactly the same task, you can add more complexity to that task by switching it up, adding a little twitch there. So maybe make the difficult tenant, or maybe the landlord is a difficult person. You already have a list of pre-established demands, or you can even change the context in which the task is done. You can actually change this to a discussion about teenagers, what teenagers want, the types of restrictions that parents may want to impose on them. So both sides can then decide on their demands and reach a compromise, because the language is very much the same. So that's it. That's the test cycle, as Mike said. I'll talk very quickly about the teacher and the learner roles in task-based language teaching. I think one of the reasons why a lot of people in general, and I think education is still very resistant to task-based language teaching, is because we want to be dominant in the classroom. There's a power relationship imbalance in the classroom where the teacher is always being perceived as the sage on the stage, the know-it-all. He knows everything. He can give me the answer to everything. And I think we need to become more vulnerable as people. I think we need to eventually tell our students that we don't know everything. We're here to learn with you. That's the whole point of lifelong learning. So with task-based language teaching, the teacher becomes more of a guide on the side as opposed to the sage on the stage. And what about the language learner? Well, the language learner moving on here, the language learner changed. The language learner is more of a group participant. He is monitoring his language, is monitoring the language of those around him. He is also taking more risks and innovating in the sense that they have to use different language. They're also thinking about strategies, like, how can I say this? Or, well, what if I try to say it this way? So, I mean, when you perform a number of tasks, either in pairs or small groups, of course, there's going to be a lot of adaptation. But what's really important for me to say about tasks is that tasks are being employed as a tool to facilitate the learning process, okay? Classroom activities should always be organized around tasks, so learners are provided with the opportunity to observe how language is actually being used in real communication, so they can both attend to the message and also the form. And what is also really interesting about tasks, as Mike said, tasks will push, again, going back to Merrill Swain's pushed output, it will push students to generate and expound messages for which they do not have full linguistic resources and prior experience with. So in reality, the main point of tasks is the skill of making guesses from linguistic and contextual clues, asking for explanation, consulting with other learners. All these things will be developed within a task-based language teaching framework. So reflecting on session aims, we have identified features of the task. We have differentiated, not so much, but Mike briefly touched upon the difference between unfocused and focused tasks. To those of you who don't remember, Mike, what's the difference?
The focus task. So focus task, well, with one, you're having a clear focus on language, which we don't want. The other one, we're having a focus on getting it done. Yeah. Which is focusing on the task.
Hopefully
so
you
move
can
away from task supported and move towards task-based language teaching.
Yeah, so you can hopefully by the end of this, now you can somewhat plan a short TBLT lesson. If you plan one, please send it to us. We would love to take a look at it and maybe even give you some feedback. And I think you understand that the role of students and teachers throughout the task cycle, they vary quite a lot. And Isel said something here. Students who are used to traditional teaching, in which teachers have to be on the stage, not the one who is always active, may not adapt to task-based language teaching. It's true. It does require a little bit of flexibility on the part of the teacher. It does require a little bit of flexibility on the part of the learners. But I honestly find that once they get a taste of this, they never want to go back. Eventually, they never want to go back. So,
and I don't think you will want to go back, because I'm just
some final thoughts here on task-based language teaching. What does language learning look like? Well, to a lot of people, language learning looks like this. It's a very straight line. You go from a beginner all the way to a high level of proficiency, a C1, C2 level. But the reality, folks, is that language learning looks more like this. It's full of zigzags, backsliding, U-shaped development. Sometimes you feel like you're making progress, but you're like, oh man, I just realized I don't know anything about this. So even in our native language, I would argue, and Eli said the same thing. So task-based language teaching, they must be adapted to the proficiency of your learners. You should always trial the tasks to actually show that they contribute to the acquisition of the language. I think, and Mike will agree with me, for TBLT to work, teachers need to have a very high degree of language awareness, which all of you have shown to have, because you need to think about what language might emerge, and you need to be ready to address that language that emerged, as opposed to preparing your whole lesson on the present continuous. And then the student uses the simple present, and you're like, well, I don't know how to teach the simple present yet. I can deal with that another time. Also, you have to be very open with your students about the purpose and the logic behind doing these kinds of tasks. And I think when teachers engage in TBLT, they have to also become responsible for the tasks, because you know your students better than I do. So you need to find out. This is why a needs analysis at the beginning of the course is extremely important, because you will know exactly the kinds of things that your students want to do. If you're teaching an EAP class or if you're teaching professionals, even more so. So to go back to what Will has said, meaning comes first in TBLT. Refining the language, accuracy comes a little bit later. So what's really important for us to remember about TBLT is that it's very different from PPP, where PPP, it lies under the assumption that out of accuracy we'll become fluent, whereas TBLT, it's based on the belief that out of fluency we eventually develop our accuracy, and that learning only happens because we are genuinely, or we have a genuine desire to communicate. And what do we know about TBLT, folks? As I said, we promote learning by doing. We're giving our students rich, elaborated, and authentic input. We're encouraging a focus on form. So students are focusing not only on the grammar, that the language that they're using, but also on communicating a message. Lots of opportunity for feedback, corrective feedback in that sense. It also is very much in line with the learner's pace. Every learner has an internal syllabus. So students are producing language that they're capable of producing. So you are almost like teaching at the point of need. You are meeting the students exactly where they are in their developmental process. Also, a lot of people mentioned this in the chat box here, a lot of cooperation, a lot of collaboration in TBLT. And at the same time, it individualizes instruction. So you're not expecting every student in the class to produce the present simple at the same time, in the same way, which to me is ludicrous. And of course, there is a lot of research to back this up. So give TBLT a try, and thank you very much for your patience, for your attention, and we have some time for Q&A. But before we do the Q&A, I want to ask people, we love to ask people, what are some of the most important takeaways for you personally from today's webinar? You can type them up in the chat and we'll look at them.
Thank you very much, Leo and Michael. It was a great session. If it's okay with you, I would like to...
we have somebody saying the task cycle. Yes. Well, you have to familiarize yourself with the task cycle as well, right? That's really important. Somebody said teacher, definite says teacher's roles. Funda said fluency leading to accuracy. Azra said, it was a great session. Thank you, Azra. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
What else? Claudia said, thank you. It was a good presentation. Thank you, Azra. Pinar, thank you, Pinar. Thank you.
Can I
you,
quickly add something
Please.
Q&A,
to
Aiden?
your presentation?
You're muted.
I am muted?
No, she's not.
No, I'm not. What I want to say is, please do not, I'm referring to my colleagues here. Please do not be afraid of grammar. Grammar is language, but teaching it in isolation is a horrible idea. Grammar, in fact, has a very important functional and notional aspect. That's why, in fact, the language uses one form, but not the other. But if you try to teach it without any real reason, any authentic context, then it becomes a headache. And it doesn't make any sense. It just scares students. Someone right? I have noticed mentioned the exams. Please, guys, we are teachers. We do not teach our students to pass exams. We teach, and then they will pass the exams. Don't forget that. If they learn, they will pass. But if you teach to pass an exam, they will fail. Please keep that in mind. Dear Leo and Michael, Defne Hocam has asked whether, I think you have mentioned it before, but whether task-based language teaching can be used for beginners or lower level students. I think you have answered this already, but would you like to just very briefly answer
Mike?
it again?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. I know Leo's been doing a lot lately, so I'll let him finish. But the short answer is yes. So if you listen to the Jane Willis episode, she actually answers this question directly, and she says, "Oh yeah, like you're thinking about a task that's appropriate and real world for the learner themselves." So I'm just thinking in terms of a low-level adult, like a new Canadian, perhaps needing to put together a grocery list. So a great task would be talking about what's in your bag, your shopping bag, right? Where you're just working with basic nouns and then comparing if your bag, what's in your bag is the same or different from what's in your classmate's bag, and then explaining what is there and what isn't there. So that would be like a real world task that you could do even with realia, right? Like no flashcards, no technology, even through a Zoom call, you could have your bag next to you. And I think that's a great sort of activity that still follows all of those stages. And then again, you can fill in the gap. Oh, I noticed you said fruit. What do we call that fruit in English? And then you can maybe show them another shopping bag as an image, or you could have your shopping bag and talk a little bit more about it in detail, and then have them go back and then redo the task where they're talking about what's in their bag, but hopefully using some of the signposts or some of the language you or the model presented as well before they do that retest. Excuse me. Leo? Yeah.
I was just going to say, there's a lot of critiques of task-based language teaching, specifically one that you asked, Aiden, that is not suitable for beginner level learners, but I think that's a fallacy. I think it was Swan in 2005 who said, beginner level learners urgently need a grammatical repertoire. I don't think they do. And it's a misconception because it assumes that TBLT necessarily involves production-based tasks that students always have to speak. It's not always the case. TBLT, and we didn't talk about this because, otherwise this presentation would be 10 hours. But TBLT can also include input-based tasks that involves learners listening, tasks that involve learners reading. So TBLT is possible with beginners, but only if it is recognized, but only if it is accepted that it does not always have to involve learners producing language.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Azran
Hujam is raising her hand. Do you want to continue, Michael?
No.
Shall we ask Azran as me? Do you want to ask
please.
your question? Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And it's a really engaging and informative session on TBLT, which I am looking for. And it's very much helpful for me. Let me introduce myself first. I'm a research scholar in India from Bangladesh. Sir, the thing what I currently I'm facing is that my research is on metacognition and listening, metacognitive instruction and listening, where I have to create a worksheet. And this worksheet is the theoretically pedagogical sequence, which is embedded on TBLT.
Okay.
And listening, there is I designed like the goal and outcome and all those things I followed up. Now I'm analyzing my data, and the problem I'm facing is that the assessment, based on what I have to analyze the growth or fall of the remain the same of the learner's status. Now, since I collected my data during this pandemic online, and they give their responses through Google Form. When I'm sitting with these forms, I've found that it's a difficult thing, because the pre-listening session, there is one activity where has one kind of metacognitive strategies like monitoring and planning. Then I come to the monitoring, evaluation, and problem solving session. Then again, it is the cyclic order that strategies come along with the TBLTs that stages, and 2-3 times of the listening played. So at the end, when I'm coming to analyze this, I cannot bring all those into a shape. Now I look forward to have all of your suggestions, especially Professor Leo and Michael, because they are experts in this field. I think I will get some suggestion, valuable suggestion to resolve.
Excuse me,
Thank you, ma'am.
my dear colleague, but
Thank you, ma'am.
what is the question, or do you need
I
to
was gonna,
contact
yeah,
Leo
Yeah.
and Michael separately,
Yeah.
individually?
I
Because
was waiting for the question.
yeah, but I failed to understand the question. If you want to contact them, I believe you can. Would you
It
like
would
to
be
share
nice
your
if I get the
emails
contact of them.
in the chat
Yeah,
box?
Oh,
we
sure.
shared our email.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I missed that. I'm
I'll
sorry.
put,
So please,
I'll share again.
please contact them individually. Thank you
Sure.
very much. Thank you.
The final assessment of those TBLT based on listening, which is the
Okay.
pedagogical.
Okay, I'm sorry. There are other people
Thank you,
asking
ma'am.
questions. Thank you very much. Azra Hocam says, if we want creative lesson plans in our online classes, should we choose unfocused tasks more than focused ones?
That's a good question. It depends on your students. I think it depends on the needs. I hate that it depends because I don't want to be on the fence here. But it really depends on the needs of your students. And I'm going to give you a very good example of that. Who asked the question, Aiden?
Azra Tajize.
Azra, look at me here. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to look at the camera here so we can answer this question together. Like at the moment, I'm working with a lot of ESP, so English for specific purposes. I'm working with EAP, English for academic purposes, and I'm also teaching general. I don't like to call it general English, but because I mean, there's no such thing as general English. But within each of these three different types of students or groups that I teach, within an EAP class, I kind of use a little bit of focus tasks with them, because within EAP, there are certain expectations that students need to, certain expectations that we have or that specific discourse community has. I cannot ask my students to just write a random introduction as if it's a narrative, starting with a question, right, Mike?
Yeah,
no,
exactly. Yeah.
It has to be a very specific genre within very specific language patterns and patterns of organization that they have to use. So for that, I would use focus tasks. However, I'm currently teaching a group of lawyers and they all have different needs. So with that group of lawyers, all I have to ask them is like, what is one thing that you need to do as a lawyer? Well, I have to present my case. Okay, so we create a task that is more unfocused in this case, where they basically have to just present their case. And then I look at the language that they produce, and then we kind of work with that. And then she has to do it again. So in that case, I don't tell them which language to use, as opposed to the EAP group. I have to expect certain things to be used. So Mike, do you want to add to that?
No, I think you're spot on, which is why I think in the chat I said earlier, that's why we need to be language analysts. We need to be language researchers, because when they tell us their need, then we have to rely on our own understandings of what does an EAP student need to know? How do they need to say it? And same for a lawyer, it's maybe working with what they already know and then filling in the gaps. So I think, no, Leo's spot on. It's a great answer. Yeah.
Okay. I have one more question here. Sedat Hocam says, the chat box changed corners.
Sorry, I stopped sharing my screen here.
Yeah, and
Oh,
now
no.
I lost it. Okay, I believe, as far as I remember, do you have any suggestions or ideas to use TBLT on in virtual classes? Sedat Hocam, if you're still with us, correct me if the question is incorrect.
Yes, that was the question. Thanks.
Okay. Can you make any suggestions for virtual classes, online classes?
Mike, do you want to take that one?
Just in the middle of putting something. Yeah, like I think, well, you can still do what I just discussed earlier. So you can make whatever resources your students have, you can think about how that can be a task. I've used a lot of Google Drive type activities or Outlook activities. So the students themselves have the task, but they're doing it collaboratively through those sorts of documents. So it's still a tenancy agreement, but in breakout rooms with Google Docs or any collaborative software, they're doing the task that way. Yeah, I don't think technology or this kind of online approach limits task-based learning. If anything, it might make it a little bit more salient because the students have access to the internet while they're working. They can look for terms, they can fill in the gaps on their own. Yeah,
I think it enhances, Mike. I think it enhances
it in many ways.
Yeah, because as you said, you have Google Docs, so students can actually produce something on Google Docs. Like, for example, just to add to what Mike was saying, I'm teaching an EAP class, and one of the things my students had to do is to create a poster presentation. So the task I gave them was to watch a video on poster presentations and then create a poster presentation on poster presentations. So they had to create a poster presentation describing what a poster presentation was. And then eventually they presented that. So again, there was none of those things would have been a problem. I mean, none of those things were a problem online, but I can see some of the limitations of doing this face-to-face because, you know, I find that students, when they're online and they have a very clear outcome, when they say, watch this video, it's a 5-minute video. And then I want you guys to understand what a poster presentation is. So they have a lot of research skills there. There's active listening. They have to make decisions on what is going to be included in the poster presentation. There's a lot of clarification questions. There's a lot of negotiation of meaning. So there's a lot of incidental language learning happening within this task cycle. It's not what you are teaching, but all the language that they have to use to negotiate and produce the poster, I think also helps. So I think saying that online classrooms are not useful for task-based language teaching, I think it's a bit of
and if I I think it's a bit of a myth. I just wanted to add there though, because I think what Leo's getting at is in a classroom, maybe we feel safer using, or we think we might feel safer using task-based language teaching because we're there, right? We can monitor and we're there and so on. But task-based language teaching, everyone, requires us to trust our students, right? It requires us to just say, you know what? I'm going to trust that they're going to do this. They're going to struggle together and they're going to do this. And I'm going to bite my tongue and I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to let them have their freedom. And then I'm going to see what they create. And, you know, 10 times out of 10, they do it, right? The problem is often us. We get in the way. So it'll work. I think we have to fight that urge or desire to be in charge and trust our students. Yeah, that's it.
And in your presentation as well, you have mentioned that there are similarities between TBLT and project-based learning. So I guess it's even easier to do that online. It is more difficult to do it in the classroom because, you know, they have limited sources in the classroom. But at home, I mean, they can use everything that they like. There are some, very basic questions, but Kibar Hocam, you were raising your hand. What happened? Have you decided not to ask your question?
If it is possible, I can ask.
Of course it's possible. Go ahead.
Yes, please.
Thank you for a great seminar or session. And just I want to ask a question. I'm not a graduate from university still, but I will start a new job to teach English young learners. But there is now in private school, but there is a teacher who focuses on grammar and teach English by speaking Turkish in this
with young learners.
Yes, young learners.
Oh my God.
Yes, I know this is bad situation, but I want to change their minds or young children minds. But I wonder whether it is possible to change their minds in short time or not. What to do, change their minds in short time, because I want to challenge this situation.
John, why don't you contact me later? Because, you know,
Okay.
I am an expert in young learners, and I will
Yes,
definitely help you with that, because Michael and Leo here talked more about task. Of course, task-based learning, it definitely works with young learners as well. If anyone says it doesn't, he's a big liar. But I don't think it's fair to keep people here to talk about young learners, because it's not our topic. Please email me, aidanashers@yahoo.com, and
yes.
I will try to do my best to help you. Don't forget, INGED is Language Teachers Association, is to help you, serve
Thank
you,
you
you
very
know?
much. Thank you very
So
much.
Özlem Hoca says, what is the difference between an activity and a task? Would you like to answer that, or is it too
Can I
big?
answer? Can I answer that by kind of like going back to Kibar's and what you just said about task-based language teaching with young learners?
Yeah.
I'm not a young learner expert. No, I have two young learners at home, two kids who challenge me all the time. But what I was going to say about that with young learners, there's a paper by Rod Ellis. I think it's called Task-Based Language Teaching for Beginner Level Young Learners. Okay. That came out in Language Teaching for Young Learners. So if you want to check out that paper, I would strongly recommend that you read it. But I think what I wanted to say about young learners is that it doesn't really change much between young learners and adults, because what you can do with a young learner is maybe there's more task preparation. And I think another fallacy is you can actually have your students use their first language to prepare. You know, you can give them some sort of input that is modified. Yeah, somebody said gradation. Yeah, you can make the input a little easier for them. Okay.
Lots
and then
of body language.
Yes, I still
Lots of
think it's
body
possible.
language.
Realia,
Yeah. So I think it's possible. I don't think it's something that is. I think it's much easier to just discredit it, Aidan, and say that like, oh, it doesn't work with young learners. It does, but it requires a little bit more of the teacher. And the difference between a task and an activity was in slide 23. Okay, but simply the difference between a task and an activity is very simple. When you walk into a classroom and you ask your students, how was your weekend? Is that a task?
That's definitely an activity.
That's definitely an activity. Talk about this is an example of an activity. I think you probably experienced this. You tell your students, okay, guys, together, talk about your weekend. And then one student says, I didn't do anything. And the other's like, I didn't do anything either. Teacher, we're finished.
Yeah.
That's not a task. But if you said to your students, okay, I want you to talk about your weekend, and I want you to find two things that you both did that were similar, and maybe two things that you both wish you had done. Now you have a very clear outcome. You have a very clear completion. They know that they will be they're done when they have found those two similarities. Or even something like talk to each other and find out who had the most interesting weekend, who had the most unusual weekend, who had the most boring weekend. Very simple modifications that you can make to activities to make them more task-like.
Yeah, and someone is asking where they can watch the recording. It will be released next week on INGED Turkey YouTube channel. And you can, if you have missed a part of this presentation, you can watch it there, but you need to wait for a week. I'm sorry. Okay, I can't see any other questions. I'm going to thank you very much again for this great presentation, this great talk. We learned a lot. We polished whatever knowledge we had. That was very nice. And my dear colleagues, of course, I thank you too, because you joined to this session. You made it possible to have a session like this. Please stay safe and hope to see you next week.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for this honor. It was really great. Yeah, teşekkürler, right? Teşekkürler. Thank you.
Mike's Turkish is better than mine. I just want to say thank you, everyone. And if you guys need to get in touch with us, we left our email. Follow us on Instagram. We're very active there. We go live every Tuesday. Our YouTube channel is not as good as Inged's Instagram. YouTube. But we're slowly building up our YouTube page. But if you want to get in touch with us, just shoot us an email, and we'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you very much, Aidan, for the invitation. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you
so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take
Bye.
care.
Well.